Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary with Karl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show.
Hi, and welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. Noticeably missing today is my lovely wife, Laura. She usually does the introduction. I'm not as good as she is, but we're going to press on today because I have two guests that I've been waiting a long time to talk to. Historians of the modern day church. They'll tell you their story, but just valuable resources for what we're going to talk about today. Thank you for tuning in. So today I have with me Becky Garrison and Brad Sargent. Say hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello. And I'm excited to have you guys here. And I didn't pull a bio or anything on you, just so that you can tell it in your own words and just give us a sense for who you are. Start with Brad, because he's up in the corner here.
Okay. I'm Brad Sargent. I live in Washington State. And really where I come into this whole thing on spiritual abuse and dynamics in churches and ministries is I was reared Lutheran, so I'm familiar with casseroles and and smorgasbords.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in college, I went to a church that was a combination of evangelical, missionary-oriented, but really underneath had fundamentalist thinking, very black and white thinking. And that's where I became a born-again Christian. And over a period of several years, then I was taking in a lot of theology, and I even considered maybe I need to go to seminary when I get out of college. But then something started happening as the pastor left to go plant a church on the other side of the state. In the process of finding a new pastor, this church in Pullman, Washington, split into 4 parts, but it took about 3 years to get to that point. So there was 3 years of building pressure to conform, legalism, trying to get you to totally just obey unconditionally without any feedback to those in charge of the process. And, they went through several candidates, and the second or third candidate missed being called to be the pastor by 1 vote. So there was a process to reconsider the pastoral candidate, and another vote was held, a couple months later, different group of people, because some were in town and some were out, and again, lost by 1 vote. So a particular group of deacons and others actually took over the church, said, we've called this guy to be our pastor, turn in your keys, turn in your other stuff, and if you don't like it, leave. And they changed the locks on the doors overnight. They put up barriers so no one could use the parking lot unless they opened the chain that was now locked. And this guy came, and he was there 3, 4, 5 years until the money ran out, and then he left. So, but meanwhile, everything split into about 4 groups. Some excommunicated some of the other groups, some wouldn't talk to certain other people. So it was kind of a mess. And here I was in college, early 20s, and this is what I'm experiencing in my first evangelical, conservative, theological church. And it's like, wow, this is really bizarre. And there were no books, no resources I could find anywhere to help. It would be another 15 years before the first books from Christian publishers on topics related to church abuse and spiritual abuse would be published. They were like 1991, 1992. So there I was in the wilderness of Pullman, Washington, trying to figure this out. So I didn't know the word deconstruction, but that's what I was starting in on in 1978 as I was trying to gain sanity again after 3 years of increasing pressure and legalism and other things. So that's the background. And what I didn't understand is, even though I gained some wisdom and insight on how did this happen, and I was asking those kinds of questions, what made me vulnerable to this? How was I susceptible? I didn't realize there were bigger patterns involved. And I ended up, over the next 45 years or so, then in 4 other situations in churches, Christian nonprofits, and ministries, where really the people that were in leadership were very self-centered, self-benefiting, narcissistic in a lot of ways, some even cruel, sadistic. But how did I get sucked in again 4 times? Well, part of it was the look of the church or ministry was different. It seemed like they were healthy, but it turned out, it's like Dante's Inferno, or his trilogy, abandon hope, all ye who enter. There's no doorway sign that says, look out, in 5 years, this place is going to crash and implode on you.
Yeah.
Anyway, I continued with deconstructing because I had more questions now, because these new situations didn't look the same as the first church split that I was in. So I had to learn more. And I started kind of piecing things together more on the institutional level. What does it look like? And not necessarily just on trying to figure out what kinds of people lead the way that ends up being abusive. So in 2007, as it turned out, I connected with a abuse survivor blog called the Wartburg Watch, and was a lurker there for a few years. But also, then I started blogging my own experiences some. And as I was looking at other churches and ministries that were making the news, I would start research writing about them and trying to put it together and, apply those same questions I'd had on my own experiences, apply those to these new situations. So I ended up doing a lot of research and resource writing since 2007. So the last 15 years, I think I lost track after about 400,000 words written. And some of the case studies took over 300 hours each. And to compile them often in real time and type up links and try and figure out things chronologically, and then always absorbing this to figure out the larger patterns. So that's kind of that side of it. 2 other things that are relevant is my background training is in linguistics, and I was never all that great at learning foreign languages. But the thing about linguistics is you learn how to absorb a lot of data and see the patterns in it. So that kind of linguist goes into a culture where there's no written language, listens for years, and writes it down, figures out a dictionary and a grammar. So what I've been doing is applying those kinds of pattern recognition skills to the larger set of case studies and personal experiences about spiritual abuse. And the other relevant point, and then I'm kind of done with my part of the story, is that I am trained also as a futurist. And a futurist is not somebody who necessarily predicts what's going to happen. They look at the cultural horizon and see what trends are happening, then work with a client to discern what trends are really affecting the decisions your group, your company, your ministry has to make, and get them to see move from the possibilities of what's happening and what's affecting them to what do you want to do about it. So shift from possibilities to preferability. How do you want to respond? So that becomes relevant in terms of if churches or individuals are considering, what direction should I go? Here I am deconstructing. What's next? Well, here's what's affecting your decisions, and what do you choose to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's me.
It's good. So Becky, tell us about you.
Okay, well, I describe myself as a prenatal Episcopalian. And the reason I do that is my late father was a sociology professor and an Episcopal priest. So follow the ecclesiology, and it makes sense that I would have been an Episcopalian from the moment I was conceived. Mm-hmm. I was raised in that tradition. I also was raised by a extended family of alcoholics. And in the 80s, I did a lot of recovery work. I found a spiritual director of the Episcopal Church who was a recovered alcoholic, and from then did a lot of recovery work. She was also connected to the charismatic wing of the Episcopal Church and got very much involved in that, was very much connected to that stream. I now realize that there was a lot of what I would call love bombing going on, but it was the first time I was ever totally accepted by, in addition to my grandmother and my grandfather who raised us after my parents died from alcoholism, I experienced unconditional love. Or so I thought it was unconditional love. I also, as part of my recovery, thought I wanted to continue my late father's work. Despite his alcoholism, he was a true visionary. He was the one who, well, he didn't introduce Timothy Leary to LSD like he claimed he did, but he was very much involved in the Timothy Leary, find yourself, discover yourself. His PhD dissertation in the 1960s was on why do some students join SDS and the Weathermen and violent groups, and others join equally stringent groups like Japuza. So what is it that would make someone want to follow Jesus and someone else want to, change the world by destroying it? And that was his, and he was always reaching out to young people, those on the horizons, those on the fringes. So I thought to myself, well, I'm not drinking. If I don't have an alcoholic problem, I'm wondering if I could fulfill my dad's ministry. So I went to institutional church structures by attending Yale Divinity School. Very soon discovered that I was much better as a prophet than a pastor. Social work degree, which is what I also got, so I could aid my pastoral skills. It nearly did me in. I was way too much of an empath. I would absorb all of the energies. I didn't understand all the dynamics. As part, in terms of, I knew that something was amiss. So I'm grateful that ordination did not work out for me, because I would have been killed probably by all the institutional nuances. My body could not have held that. However, that's the exact qualities needed for a writer. So when I discovered the Wittenberg Door, the nation's oldest, largest, and at that time, the only religious satire outlet. The Babylon Bee, by the way, is not a religious satire outlet because they claim that their goal is to bring down leftists. And the goal of a satirist is to bring down anyone in power who uses the name of Jesus for their own personal profit gain instead of, let's just say, platform over prophecy. They're looking more for their own profit, their own platform, their own. And I thought with this, when I worked with the Door, this is a perfect way for me to discuss any anxiety I had and angst about the church, and I just let it rip. It was, but what I didn't realize at the time, because the research was not there, is that some people who would critique us, like Jerry Jenkins, took it in stride. We had so much fun with Jerry Jenkins, the Cleft Behind series, the Plumbers Edition, you name it. But he got it. He understood that a satirist is a court gesture to the king. That's what our role is. We keep the king honest. So he agreed to have me come in and interview him. Other people, and I would say televangelists and the U.S. Emerging Church were among the two worst, who had very thin skin. The moment you would critique anything about them, they would completely explode. You are evil. You're a wingnet. How do you want to go to hell? They could give me these different options. When Fred Price secretary said, "How do you want to burn in hell?" I'm a Southerner. So I said, "Barbecue." And that's the natural answer. But over time, as I got to this research of narcissism, the door closed in 2005. And I discovered through the world of Christian publishing, without losing that little anchor, it was very hard for me to get myself established in the church. Also, a religious satirist walks into a place and we're like, you just ate a cheese, bean, and broccoli burrito. No one really wants to get near you because you're going, there was this fear that you were going to make fun of them. This is this new, loving kind of church community we're trying to build up, and here you are taking a complete dump on it. Well, I started developing divinity school and really honed it, being a religious satirist, a very good BS detector. I could tell when I was being lied to here. And I could also tell by my body feeling when I was not in a very healthy, safe space. But I didn't know what to do with those feelings. There wasn't any research about narcissism other than what Brad is noting, that there's been some research starting in the 60s and 70s, but it didn't really hit the zeitgeist until I'd say like 2015, 2016. And at that time, I left the institutional church to go to the Pacific Northwest. I felt really called to the Celtic spirituality in this region where people were, the cathedral became, for me, not a church building, but the pine trees. I began this very exploring this connection to nature. And I discovered there were a lot of other people doing this as well. However, even these settings, they might have left it, the setting, but I would still go to these settings and kind of feel something a little bit amiss in my stomach. This doesn't quite feel like a totally organic grassroots movement. Something doesn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. I then began a professional, personal relationship with a mindfulness therapist who had training in trauma. And that relationship imploded in the most destructive way. All of a sudden, this behavior was bizarre. I couldn't understand how anyone with a training in mindfulness could act this cruel and this vicious. And then that led me to find a narcissistic support group. Where I was like, I started reading up on that, and I realized, actually, when I wrote my book, Jesus Died for This, in 2010, I was reading about Merrill Marco and narcissism, and then it hit me. My dad's behavior was not just alcoholism, but narcissism. And because of the patterns of self-centeredness, the inability to show empathy and compassion are very common among addicts and narcissists. The difference is if the alcoholic sobers up, which my dad never did, so I never could experience if this was actually true of him. But when they sober up, they can develop empathy and compassion because they now are free from the addictive substance that was controlling their behaviors. But then I started realizing that I did all this work on alcoholism, Adulthood of Alcoholics, the Melanie Beatty, Codependent No More, the support groups, therapy, whatnot. But there was still this aching feeling inside of me. So through the narcissistic support group, I learned about EMDR, and eventually I tried that, and there was a somatic treatment. From that, all of a sudden, I realized I wasn't getting triggered. I would go to these settings, and I could just see patterns. I could spot, I'm in a setting ruled by narcissists. I'm out of here. You cannot fix these settings. You cannot change them. The only thing you can do is exit. And so what I'm interested in helping other people is you find these in all forms of settings led by secular or spiritual or Christian religious gurus. Shambhala Buddhism, Bikram Yoga, a number of exposés involving different sex cults, involving on a more secular basis. It has to do with a guru and follower dynamic. And once you recognize this and get yourself treated for whatever is triggering you, you can spot it, and then you can now find much more healthier communities. And you can also realize just how incredibly narcissistic our overall culture is right now.
Mm. Yeah, so starting with Brad, you talked about bigger patterns, and so from 1978, when you kind of started this journey to now, is narcissism the biggest pattern that we see running through spirituality and religion and culture? Is that the biggest issue? Is that the biggest pattern? Is that the most important thing we could talk about? Give me all your thoughts. Anything around those areas?
What strikes me is in terms of the individuals who lead abusive institutions, narcissism, and a few other related things are really key, and we've learned more and more as time goes on. So the dark triad, for instance, if you're familiar with that term, that is Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. And so some of the characteristics that are typically in a list of this is what narcissism looks like, some of those sort out to other parts of that triad. And so you start seeing, like Becky talks about the inability to be emotional, domineering, manipulative, no empathy. So those spread across several different psychological areas. So that helps, I think, understand what's going on with the individuals who set this up. But it can come out in different ways, and that is in terms of an institutional kind of persona. So it can be, control. It's all control, but it's controlled by compliance. So everybody has to be the same way, and so it's more legalistic. Or it could be controlled by chaos. So if you look at, for instance, the Cultural Revolution in China, the people who were Mao's leaders underneath him sometimes got thrown in prison because he would change the rules from day to day or week to week or year to year. So what you did that was according to the rules last week, if you did it this week, it could get you thrown in prison. You have complete insecurity, so people can jerk you around any which way. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, as Becky talked about, behavior can be very cruel, and an entire system can be that way, such as the Khmer Rouge was known for extreme violence and genocide. Competition. Sometimes a leader will give the same task to two different people, but not give them enough detail, and sometimes not even let them know that both of them have the same task, and so they end up competing with each other. And then other institutions can be hooked into conspiracies and kind of long cons so that it's self-benefiting to the leaders. But the thing is, I go back to something a friend of mine in those discussions after the 1978 church split. She said this: manipulators and martyrs go together in matched pairs. Mm-hmm. Manipulators and martyrs go together in matched pairs. And so what I saw was I had certain vulnerabilities to be hooked in by different kinds of leaders according to what they saw that they needed in order to get their plan working. So like Becky, she talked about being high on empathy scales. I am too, and also a practitioner. So if you have somebody who's a visionary and everything is just kind of all very theoretical and abstract, they're going to be looking for somebody who can put their vision into practice. Or if they really don't have strong emotions, either show no emotions or no empathy, they're going to look for people who are, but they know how to manipulate us to get us leveraged in. So I think that that's an important part. It's not so easily separated. Individuals influence the institutions, and the institutions influence the individuals. If you take an abusive, narcissistic leader out of the institution, then how their toxicity taints the system doesn't just flush out immediately, if at all. So one of the situations I was in had I would say, a very narcissistic and chaotic lead by chaos. You never knew what was going to change in terms of the mission statement or what was going to be the next priority. It just changed with the weather. But after he left that particular place, it took over 3 years to get all the administrative files and everything straightened out. So that's just, I think, something to keep in mind is people who are narcissistic are wolves on the outlook for sheep. They know what they're looking for, and they will figure out what are our strengths that actually make us susceptible to being sucked into their particular schemes.
Becky?
Oh, no, and I think to piggyback on what Brad was saying is Deborah Lloyd introduced me to the work of Margaret Wheatley, who was very invaluable. She wrote a book on leadership of who do we want to be. And in this, she describes the work of a British anthropologist whose name all of a sudden has escaped me, from the 1950s, who describes in civilization cycles, and Karen Armstrong and others have done this. We're in the age of decadence. Christopher Lasch wrote a book about narcissism in 1979, noting how the me generation of the 70s produced this era of self-centeredness. And the decadence is marked by a focus on banality, a undue focus on celebrity, media likes, and whatnot. And we're in the cycle of this. But at the end of that is also a pioneering cycle where the next cycle is beginning. And you're seeing this. You're seeing people moving into a post-church state where the church, I mean, we are correct that we're kind of undergoing it. We're due for another reformation. And but as we undergo it, we can't really label this because everybody keeps saying, I'm the leader of this revolution. I'm the leader of this. And we don't really know because we're right in the middle of this. What we do know is that there's a lot of people looking for something different. They want to believe in something. They're very susceptible now, especially, we are not living together in our communities where we don't have extended family anymore. The church for many people became family. The number one reason people say when they leave church is, I miss the community. But I couldn't go along with the agenda anymore. I had to leave. And so in that state, unless they deal with why they felt so attracted to wanting to follow this new vision of someone who's led by a narcissist, until they understand how to recognize the signs that this is not healthy, they're going to continue to repeat the cycle. I'll cite as one example. I happened to move to see the Pacific Northwest right as Mark Driscoll was resigning. So I was in Seattle covering this. I soon discovered as a female doing the reporting that I reported to Wenatchee the Hatchet and Warren Throckmorton what I was observing on the ground at Driscoll's Bellevue Church, where the protests and whatnot were going down, because I realized that being a female reporting in conservative evangelical circles, they're much more likely to trust males. So I said, let's just get the story out there. It doesn't matter whose name is attached. During that, some people who had been abused themselves, tried to make themselves the center of the story. And there's one dynamic that's very inherent in this, is that a lot of times people who have been abused then try and become abusers. So trying to report on this, as I've mentioned, can be very, very tricky. Victims' memories of any form of abuse are not linear. Any trauma therapist will tell you this. That's why it's important to me to hear the feedback of trauma therapists, to understand for people the cycle of when someone has been traumatized by a narcissist, the ways they can kind of heal their body from this and then not repeat the pattern, from happening again. Because I think that people continue to exit these spaces. And in the case of Mars Hill, a lot of them left that Mars Hill, but then they went to the other, became addicted, literally, I'm not using that term, to what the other Mars Hill was speaking. And it's like, oh, he's such a great guy. He's such a great leader. He's such a pastor this, pastor that. And, Nadia Bolz-Weber has even said that I'm the liberal, muscular version of muscular Christianity. Well, Mark Driscoll perfected that cussing pastor hipster mode, which actually can be traced back to the Young Leadership Network, from which Driscoll and the U.S. Emergent Church emerged. And I'm using this as an example that you can leave one toxic setting, you're going to enter another toxic setting led by maybe a kinder, gentler, less overt, more covert form of narcissism. But in the progressive church, their very tendency to say, oh, those bad evangelicals for Trump. Here I am. Let's go support evangelicals for Biden. Oh, bad moral majority. Let's have a new moral majority. And there's this whole reinvention of things with a more progressive twist, but it still has the underlying pinnings of being led by people that possess very strong narcissistic traits. And in my research, what I discovered is the average population has 1% to 3% extreme narcissism, like diagnosed with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. And that's a very hard diagnosis because one of the criteria is that the narcissism impacts your life. For a lot of narcissists, not only thinking of yourself is a great way to achieve a career, whether it's inside the church or outside the church. If you just focus on what can I do to benefit myself and how can I make this happen, you will be incredibly successful. The Christian industrial complex loves their Christian best-selling authors, their Christian celebrities. They will push you to do whatever it takes to sell, not what it takes to build up the kingdom. But among clergy, they're estimating at the low estimate, I've heard up to 25% of clergy have extreme narcissist takes. It's always been one of the top professions among those that have narcissistic traits. And the key among that is an inability to express empathy or compassion for another person.
What was the percentage of that?
They're estimating up to 25%. I've heard that there hasn't been a lot of research into this, but by all signs, look at how many people go into ministry because it's about them. And the moment you can recognize that this isn't a new church, this isn't a new vision, this person is selling you so you can pay to play. Just buy all their books and you'll be a better person, kind of, so to speak.
Yeah. So, Brad, I want to ask two questions at once. Can you cure narcissism? And am I too simplistic if I think that when Constantine put the preacher up on a stage, when all that happened and we began to meet in big buildings and things like that, what if we just took away the stage? And of course, no pastor or theologian or seminary professor wants to even talk about things like that. But those two statements I just made, what do you have to say?
As far as a cure, I don't think that that's very possible. I think what
let me say also, I'm sorry, before you get going, also, is the worst thing you can do for a narcissist is to put them on a stage, right? I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So basically, you don't get the extreme narcissism overnight. I mean, that's a long-term thing of entitlement, response to their culture and upbringing. Who knows what else is going on, in terms of just bringing that in by osmosis during their formative years. So from what I've seen and just observed and experienced in my own church and ministry life, it's not going to change. But I think the best you can do for an extreme narcissist is get them to see that they have to control the behavior by putting on accountability and consequences. So they are culpable for a lot of harm done to others, and they're not going to change or even control the behavior unless that is put upon them. I think we see that at the national level with political stuff very much so right now. The other question was what kind of underneath that is, what is it about our theology and our ecclesiology that perhaps sets us up for problems? So one of the things I had been involved in church planting from the mid 1990s to about the mid 2000 decade, including doing church planter assessments. So I'm pretty familiar with that system. One of the things that would come up is the architecture of a system, of a church. And so, your question had me consider putting somebody in the pulpit, making them the center of attention. That's perfect for most kinds of narcissism that I have been exposed to. That's what they want. They want center stage. So the architecture in typical ecclesiology nowadays just helps with that. One of the ways to get around it, I think, is you are in smaller groups. Preaching is not the central thing, the only thing. You're looking at other modes where all people have spiritual gifts in the church and are exercising them. So it isn't a system where there's one main celebrity, one key person. It's more flat. But even then, I think of some of the progressive things that happen with like Emergent Village. Kind of presented itself as having a flat structure. No, we don't have, the one preacher. But as it ended up, you had some key celebrities that everybody turned their attention toward. So you can have abusive stuff happening in a flat structure just as much as you can have it in a hierarchical structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. Becky, what do you say?
Well, I think that he is spot on. If you look at the early church, Jesus was objecting to the narcissistic behavior of the Pharisees. I think an inability to express empathy and compassion has been with us in various forms. They would not describe, the behavior of Caligula might have been just as depraved as that of Bill Clinton, but they would have called it something else. So we can't there's a problem of looking at history through contemporary psychological lenses. We are always going to find ourselves in a state, but I think what we have to look at broader is we are in a period of major decline. People are looking for answers, they're looking for meanings. They've been doing this search for quite some time, and whenever this happens, it is fertile ground for narcissistic cults to emerge. And we're in a period of great instability. We have everything from COVID to Gaza to we don't know what's going to happen. And when you're in that state, a person can come along and say, I have the answer for you. And, like this can happen to anybody. Now, I thought I was in pretty emotionally good shape when I met this mindfulness therapist, but I just moved to Portland. So I had very few friends. I was still meeting people. I was still making friends. I was in a vulnerable situation. Cults prey on kids on college campuses that come from an international background. They don't know anybody. You just went through a divorce. Mark Driscoll was keen on getting in people without fathers. I was surprised, maybe not, how many progressive people I've met who are recovered alcoholics. And some, like my late spiritual director, Judy Balmer, they really went through a dark night of the soul. They really went through the recovery process. She was the mother to a lot of us that never had a mother. And that is the beautiful part when someone is integrated. Because of that, but I also can see now how so many narcissists took advantage of her kind, sweet, genuine nature by kind of setting her aside in favor of more glitzy preachers, in favor of the more glitzy glamour, because she was just ordinary. And sometimes the ordinary, we're like, this isn't like dynamic, exciting, new, and innovative. But look at this. We're going to do Coldplay and candles. Oh, wow. Look at this. Look at how innovative we are. And I actually listen to some of the church music of people say we're in this innovative service. And I walk in there and go, this is crap. This is performative art. This is like going to an art show. This is not building up a community. It is creating a nice performance space where you can have an event. And for sometimes I think it's important to look at these. If you look at certain things from an event perspective, I had a nice time at that concert, but that's not what a church is supposed to be. It's not like going to a nice concert, a nice nightclub. And here in the Pacific Northwest, I would say that the brew pubs and the tasting rooms, and it's why my latest book is on covering distilled spirits, not the Holy Spirit, because I'm finding much more community in the Pacific Northwest craft culture where people just get together to have a good time, figure stuff out. And people that develop a narcissistic tendency in the craft culture are called out. And you can just see, it's so interesting when you go into an environment that doesn't have a lot of narcissistic energies. It has jerks. It has assholes. I'm not going to say that this isn't perfect. But when you go into a space that doesn't have like this whole performative, look at what we're doing, look at how great we are, rather than, here's this wine I made, go try it, it's really tasty. It just changes the dynamics completely. And you can really just relax and be. And I think people are looking for places where they can just be. Do people care if I'm not there? Do people care if I'm gone? And the answers in narcissistic community is you'll discover the moment you stop giving money, the moment you stop showing up, no one will check in on you. No one cares.
Yeah. Both of you have mentioned trauma, and trauma is a big word right now. You're talking about, the emergent church and so on. I became a pastor in 1997 and was one for 20 years. I was at rural churches, and we didn't even know what the emergent church was, or who Mark Driscoll was, or anything like that. And we certainly didn't talk about trauma. We always, so I'm in small churches, we always had good intentions. We want to save the lost or something, help them. Yet most of our money went to buildings and salaries, and that was about all we could afford. We give some to mission, some to the Southern Baptist Convention, and things like that. But trauma never came up. And after 20 years of that, I crashed. This is my story. I had a dark night, and it was like everything that I'd stuffed down for 20 years was coming up. And, we call that a lot of different things, but what I know now is I had some unaddressed trauma that I probably had when I went into the church experience, and then being a pastor, continued to have to deal with. And in some ways it made it worse. So start again with Brad. What do you have to say about trauma? I guess my questions are, is it, some people say 1 in 3 people have religious trauma. I've heard that number. May have other different numbers, but is that true? Is that what's really happening? How does it happen? What can we do about it? Answer any of those you want to answer.
Yeah, I don't have anything that I've seen or read recently about statistics, but it wouldn't surprise me that 1 in 3 has experienced religious trauma. It just seems very widespread. From what I have studied since 2007, so 15 years of looking at different case studies, it seems to me that I have found examples of spiritual abuse, religious trauma, inflicted in every theological stream that's a major stream. Every form of polity, so whether it is Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, congregational, or kind of a franchise church, it's a kind of a different format. It still shows up there. It shows up regardless of whether you have a hierarchical system or a flat, egalitarian distributed system. And it shows up regardless of whether you think there needs to be patriarchy and there's hard complementarianism or egalitarianism, as with Willow Creek. So it can happen regardless of what your theology is. And over the decades that I've been looking at this, I have had people contact me from just that whole range of streams. So often the spiritual abuse is coupled with sexual abuse or some other form of like clergy sexual misconduct, childhood sexual abuse that is not acknowledged. And so there's all these other layers, domestic violence. So all the forms of abuse are present in all these churches. So
let's start there for a second. So when someone says, Karl, I'm sorry you experienced trauma, and I can see why you're so angry because you have so much trauma, and then they follow that up with, I'm sorry that was your experience. I've never seen that happen. I've gone to church all my life. I've never seen trauma, right? So, I mean, what do you say to someone like that?
I think
you just don't, I mean,
go ahead.
Can we finally get to the point where we say, just stop saying those kind of things? Because trauma does happen, did happen. It's going to continue to happen unless we do something different.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's okay. What we see happening on survivor comments on Twitter and other social media is like, just because he didn't rape you doesn't mean he didn't rape me. Just because you weren't sucked in doesn't mean I wasn't. So this is the thing about narcissism, is they always have a cover. They have people who will perpetuate the platform, and some people they won't, manipulate in the usual ways that they find the susceptible people and really traumatize them. But that doesn't mean that the others haven't seen what's gone on. They just haven't interpreted it. They haven't seen the bigger picture, or they don't understand that just because something bad didn't happen to them, that doesn't mean it wasn't happening.
And I think a lot of this is also changing the concept. I've mentioned it took me quite a long time to understand that no one came to my parents' assistance when they were alcoholics because they didn't have the knowledge of alcoholism. Before Betty Ford came out in 76, I believe, and my parents died in 77, 78. But before she came out, alcoholism was a moral failing. The concept that you could get healed medically from alcoholism, that you could, the whole notion of recovery, that there was a family component, there was a spiritual component, the whole notion of recovery was foreign. And now it's so standard that we just now know, oh, you're an alcoholic. We now have sympathy for you. We don't look at you as this vile member of the community. So a lot of this is the need to train people in the cycle of trauma. For example, trauma requires 3 people: the perpetrator, and of course their victim. Then there's the enablers, the people that let this happen. In the Christian context, is there a vestry? Is there a hierarchy of people that hired this person? Is he a solo? How is this person held accountable? Because in every instance of abuse, there's a lack of accountability. The Christian industrial complex, which is the whole media industry, they hope that you need to have a huge platform in order to land a Christian book deal. So if someone who is saying to you, and that's a carrot that's often used to get, you're an associate pastor. If you speak up, I'm going to make sure that you never work again. I'm going to make sure that you cannot lead this. You're not going to be able to lead this youth group if you say what you saw. So there's a lot of ways in which they're kind of like, if you're going against the grain, we're going to seriously punish you. But if you educate people about the role that perpetrators and enablers, and the third group are the watchers, the people that stood by and just saw this and said nothing. So if you explain to people what the cycle is, and then you explain to them that people don't even understand in the context of a domestic violence cycle why an abuser would go back to their why an abused person would go back to their abuser. Once you understand the concept of love bombing, you understand it's really trauma bonding. That the person who's been emotionally deprived, all of a sudden, when they behave right, they get this love. They are so loved. As long as you agree with what pastor says, as long as you agree with whatever social justice initiative we're doing, as long as you use in the liberal churches, you're using all the correct pronouns, you're saying all the right things, now you're accepted. And you need that so badly. So that's why I think it's important to help people understand the somatic ways you can be treated for, therapy. I get pissed if somebody says something about me that's, malicious and inaccurate, but I don't overreact, because I would overreact when people would, call me every name under the book when I was trying to expose, satirize religious beliefs. And it took me a while to realize that that's because of my trauma triggers. So now I don't get triggered anymore. I also walk into a lot of settings. That's why I don't go to an institutional church. There is none in the state of Oregon that fits my Episcopal sensibilities. It just doesn't exist. So I kind of call myself a apophatic Anglican agnostic, and I'm culturally Anglican, but there isn't a church that works for me. I didn't leave the Episcopal Church. It left me. And I think people, the more you can understand and educate people around the dynamics of alcoholism, similar to how we educate, the church has been very great at educating people about addiction. That's been a very good for certain people. I mean, sometimes it can get a little too God heavy, and some of the I'm not discussing the biblical counseling that can get downright crazy, but in many places, the Episcopal Church was the first church that would do funerals for people with AIDS back in the 80s. So the church in many ways has done, look at their history, Martin Luther King came out of a church movement. I'm not trying to denigrate church movements. I just think we have to look at the aspects of where it's now hit a level where it is at the healthiest place for someone to be. And at this juncture, I would probably say the institutional church is not. I do know some individual pastors who are doing some amazing work outside the fringes. I think it's time for the institutional church to have another reformation. And in some ways, it's having it. It's just in the mainline churches, there's so many endowments involved, and you can't look at the money involved. There's a lot of churches that have almost nobody coming to church on Sunday, but there's this paid choir singing because lady so-and-so left it in her will that this is how it is to be. Mm-hmm. So, but meanwhile, you have all these lovely nonprofits that would kill to use the church space. The church cannot think, what does it mean to be the church in the community? It's now thinking more, how do I get my name on the bestseller list? Rather than how do I function as a pastor in the parish, in my community.
Yeah, those are some deep things. Both of you have mentioned accountability a couple of times, that accountability is important. And here's what I see among celebrity pastors that get caught. The bigger star they are, the shorter their detention period lasts, and that they're back in the pulpit, they're back. And I still am kind of bound by what I think, that the worst thing you can do for a narcissist is give them a platform. It's just like an alcoholic, you don't give them beer, or whatever their drink is, So accountability means what? Let's just kind of start with Brad.
On the topic of accountability, a couple things come to mind. One is, in terms of the last, say, 20 years or so, there's been more interconnection among abuse survivor communities. So people who are from domestic violence backgrounds as survivors, those from sexual abuse, those from religious trauma and spiritual abuse, racism. There are more conversations coming across that show what the commonalities are in those dynamics. And so that's one element. Another element is, starting in the mid-2000 decade is when you really had more survivor bloggers, quote unquote, that were posting about their experiences, documenting the evidence, profiling the people who were the perpetrators or the perpetuators of a platform for somebody who was abusive. And that then becomes one form of accountability, is to have the facts out there. But it became really difficult to get anything published, like in magazines or books. So it really was, as far as specific situations, the people that experienced it were the ones that were writing about it, the survivor bloggers. And so that really helped, because it shone kingdom Klieg lights into the darkness. So that became a form of accountability. And then also more calling for, basically, if somebody has been identified as spiritually abusive, in this case, they need to be put out of a ministry situation probably for the rest of their life. I mean, there are some things like clergy sexual misconduct that if they were in certain other professions, they would be decertified. They would lose their license. They would never be allowed to do that again. Mm-hmm. So, there's movement towards that in terms of a trend with spiritual abuse, is to keep bringing up the facts, keep linking to the evidence, keep advocating for the survivors, and keep advocating that this person or that person should not be published, should not have a platform, should not be preaching, etc., should not be at conferences, because there's no indication of change, real deep change.
Mm-hmm. Becky?
Well, I agree 100%. I have a few other things that I'm thinking about. And one is, when you look to planning events, why do you have to go to a Christian conference where you're spending hundreds of dollars to talk about poverty? If you look at, I remember going to Trinity Wall Street and Sojourners anti-poverty conferences, and there's no homeless people there because they can't afford the barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. I think if you start looking at this whole concept, is the whole Christian conference circuit. Why are you paying money? Like you pay money to see a stand-up comic. We kind of treat our clergy the way we treat our performers. I'm going to go hear Green Day. I'm going to go hear this band. If you start treating and looking at this elevation, we've decided in a church context, and a lot of the books aren't that good. These are written by people that are very good marketers. They're not breaking any new ground.
Right.
So, a lot of this stuff has never been vetted by scholarly sources. You have explained to people the difference with sponsored content, which I think is becoming a big trend with a lot of news these days, is what is actually news reporting. A lot of these people do not know how to vet sources. They're not presenting anything new. So I'm not seeing a lot of I like to see more of this, a critique of where's the beat? What's there? This isn't anything. They're saying this is the most provocative, interesting stuff about human sexuality, for example. And you read it and you're like, well, you're not referencing Elizabeth Fiorenzo. You're not referencing Phyllis Tribble. You're not mentioning Boswell. You're not referencing all the decades of research into human sexuality and faith. That's just one example. But a lot of these books have no they're there. They're just designed because the person works with a marketing person, works with branding, works with this. And the question is, why are you reading this crap? To ask, and that's why I want to go back to the person needing to get help for their own trauma triggers. Because once you get, it just is mind-blowing to me how different I looked at life now that I've done EMDR. I look at people, I still can have just as strong a BS detector. I can tell when something's amiss, but I just don't react. I'm like, so you want to be a jackass for Jesus? Mm-hmm. Well, go be a jackass for Jesus. Right. And then you yell at me and say, oh, you're so mean, you go to hell. I'm like, whatever. And it is frustrating because I think that more people, rather than pointing out individual pastors, is to get people to see that system for themselves. Because too often I also think we have an empathy compassion problem in our country, because when someone says to you, I went on a date with so and so, or I had this encounter with so and so, and your response is, well, that's not how he comes across to me. There's no curiosity. What? Maybe the two of you are oil and vinegar, and the two of you do not get along, but why are you not more curious to find out why all these accusations? And we also tend to only focus on sex. I mean, Pat Robertson was one of our favorite targets of the door, and he never got caught because the only sin he did is he had sex with his wife before he was married, when he charted the birth of their first child. But his crimes were, blood diamonds in Africa. His crimes were financial impropriety. He was calling for the assassination of foreign leaders and doing all kind of horribly extreme narcissistic behaviors. But because they didn't involve sex, and that's also true of Mark Driscoll, that if you don't actually get caught with your pants down, literally, people don't view it as abuse. They don't look at spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and physical abuse. They don't look at those factors the same way they do, oh my God, they had sex, And so, and I'm not saying, I'm not trying to degrade or denounce that as not being important, but they're not looking at it within a much larger context of what does it mean to be an abusive institution. And the institution is going to protect itself. I mean, the Episcopal Church House of Bishops has no means of censoring a bishop, for example. Someone gets to be a big name pastor who all of a sudden can draw in the crowds. Even in a hierarchical church, no one's going to rein that person in because it's just giving too much buzz for the ministry overall. And eventually it runs and flows. We had the Bishop Pike scandal of the 1960s. If you research that one, it was a gentleman he predated Spong. He was preaching basically the most liberal type of teachings. It was deemed heretical by the Episcopal Church. And instead of dealing with him, and they ended up censoring him, and then he died when he went to go off in the desert looking for visions of God. But no one thought, how do you deal with someone who is saying stuff that's visionary, but also engaging in destructive behaviors? Because if you go back at his ministry, it was a very complicated ministry. So the church has never, to me, successfully dealt with a problematic clergy person. And to me, it would start at the beginning by looking at how do you ordain people. The church still has a used car salesman approach to looking at who we're going to select to be the leaders of our church. And that's among churches that don't have the self-appointed leadership model.
Yeah, for sure. I have this assumption that very few pastors enter the ministry with bad intentions. I don't know any that went in and said, well, I'm going to wreak some havoc and ruin some lives, and I'm only going to think of myself. And I don't think any of them go in with that intention. But they do bring their baggage in, and like we mentioned, it's not checked at the door. No, in many cases, we don't know how to check them, right, as they're coming in, and we've talked about that just a little bit. But also, as my wife says, when every pastor that I took, the people love bombed me in the beginning and pushed me up on the pedestal, and when they did that, it didn't help me. It made me worse, right? And so it gets worse, and the more success they have, it gets worse and worse. And if I understand you guys right, it's almost a hopeless endeavor to go, well, we're just going to change the pastor. We're going to fix him. And what I hear you saying now in the last interchange a little bit is when we become trauma informed, if that 1,500 member church starts to change, then not only can they recognize it, but they can also maybe help implement change, systemic change, hopefully. Right? So, Brad, what do you think?
I think that's getting toward it. It's difficult to dismantle an entire institution.
Yeah.
One of the things that can be done is, if it's moderately unhealthy, you can still work to change some things and work toward prevention. So that, now this is where the education, like Becky is talking about, can come in, and the forms and calls for accountability that we're seeing, like since September 2017, with the beginning of the Me Too hashtag movement, that really started a new cycle of understanding calls for accountability. Anyway, the prevention, I think, is going to be more important, and how you screen. I was involved, as I may have mentioned, a church planter candidate assessment. And one of the things that's difficult about that entire system is it's built on, are you a visionary leader? So, well, if you, and how well do you do at getting buy-in from people? So that is a hop, skip, and a jump away from how good of a manipulator are you? Can you create some theoretical thing that you can spin this tale and get people to follow you? So I think that it needs to be changed from the base upward as far as who is a healthy type of leader. One of the things I go back to as a quote, as I've read a lot of the Dune saga by Frank Herbert, and he was concerned about false messiahs and the nature of leadership and religious terminology used for abusive purposes. And one of the quotes that I have from him is this. He was talking about Lord Acton, who said, "Power corrupts. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely." But Frank Herbert said, in background to Dune, it's not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. So it isn't like somebody necessarily goes in full bore corrupted, but over time that can happen, as you sort of talked about, with cycles of success, that spins you in another revolution around being on a platform. So that's a thought on that.
Okay. Becky?
And a lot of that is because the Christian industrial complex, I don't know if people understand the pressure to platform in the Christian. And one reason why I'm so excited that I'm with a small press is that I'm getting better personalized service, and there's much less expectation of how much I have to play. I mean, I had one publisher, 80% of books sell less than 5,000 copies. And I had one book that sold 10,000, and I was really psyched about that number. The publisher wanted 20. And I was not willing to do the degree of whoring myself out. I was not going to do atheists versus Christians cage matches. I was not going to do the online holy hipster type. And I worked for the Wittenberg door, so I know how to get that whole package going. I just couldn't whore myself out to sell 20,000 copies, which is what they wanted. The fact that we have a Christian publishing empire, HarperCollins Christian Publishing, which owns the copyrights to almost every Bible except the NEB used by the Catholics, should give people pause. There is a huge pressure. If you want to be on this guest blog so you can get this book contract, you need so many ducks in an order. And we have to look at this. Why do people want to read that book versus a book by a smaller press that's much more illuminating? I mean, I've been rereading, since Thich Nhat Hanh passed away, all of the Thich Nhat Hanh books. I remember rereading all the Henry Nouwen. There are so many books you can read that are classics, that'll enlighten you, that have timeless teachings. Why are you reading the latest pile of celebrity bestseller books? Are you not aware of how they're manipulated? I mean, Mark Driscoll bought his way to the result source. But more importantly, right before that book came out, Rachel Held Evans and Mark Driscoll engaged in a very public battle where they got their two sides all lined up, all fight. And all of a sudden, the fight calmed down. Why more people couldn't see that as being totally manipulated by the publisher? Why they cannot see a massive media buy by a publisher the week or two before a book drops? If they cannot see how many books They might not be bought outright by Mark Driscoll, but understand how you're manipulated by the Christian media complex. Why do you feel your conference will not be a success if you don't get X as a speaker? If you can't get X as a speaker, your conference will fail. This is a house of cards. It's standing on sand. Why are you even having an event if you require a certain performer to make it zing? What is going on here? I've seen so many cases of, let's repackage this into the, Acts 29 exploded. Now let's do this. Now let's do that. There's so many efforts to try to reinvent the wheel without looking at it. Maybe we need a different diagram.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we need to do something totally different. Yeah. And my wife, Laura, I wish Laura could be here. She's a school teacher, so during the day she's gone. But she just, she keeps reminding me, I have this podcast that you guys are appearing on, and then there's groups that kind of form, and I had a publisher for a while, and there's groups with that, and there's things that happen. Then you get disappointed, and things happen that are disappointing, and I'll be all depressed. And Laura will say to me, "Why don't we just do our own thing and do it well, and put our heart into it, and not worry about those kind of things, those show business things." And that's what it amounts to, like you guys are alluding to, it's just all show business. It's who can attract the most followers and who can, and so on, right?
Yeah, but it's also pushed by a Christian industrial complex, and people have to look at it. You want to be part of the cool club. I mean, I was in the 70s. We were stupid enough. We bought pet rocks. I mean, I'm not saying that, but granted, in that time I was in high school. I mean, look at all the stupid, we bought Beanie Babies. We always want to buy into the latest fad. So some of that is looking into, why do you have to have this latest thing? Why do you feel you need to have this book on your coffee table? So when guests come over, you feel like you are with it. You're part of the cool crowd. Why are you going to this conference? Just ask yourself these questions for yourself. What are you getting out of this? Why do you have to be part of the cool kid club?
Or maybe even, why can't we just have a great conversation like this and gain wisdom from each other without worrying about how many people see it or whether it makes me successful or all those things, right? Brad?
Yeah, the definition of success so much goes back to a business model. And I mean, even with the church planter assessment stuff, Charles Ridley, who developed that originally from business leadership models and what defines quote unquote success. We have to start over from scratch and redo our research and figure out what is healthy. And healthy is successful. Healthy is sustainable. Healthy can survive cultural trends that would seek to smash us or implode us. Healthy can be inclusive. Healthy is a whole lot more as a system that is sustainable. But you get this success stuff like Becky was talking about with the Christian industrial complex. It's businesses, it's brands, it's academia, it's ministry platforms, it's publishers and it's events, but it's all in a silo. And just the picture that comes to mind, I do a lot of visual thinking. And if you've ever been at one of the fairs where you're in that big drum where it goes around and around and then the bottom drops out, and it just centrifugal force keeps you going. Mm-hmm. Once you're in that silo, man, you're just being spun around, and you may not realize then suddenly the bottom drops out when suddenly your favorite celebrity does something so egregious that you can't ignore it. Mm-hmm. You can't not see it.
Yeah.
But then you could ignore it.
And that speaks into the need to develop the eyes to see. And that's where the education comes in. I mean, when I grew up, and this is in college, we were taught how not to get raped. We were taught what not to do when you go to a fraternity party. We're now having a lovely conversation about maybe guys shouldn't put crap in women's drinks. And so I think a lot of this with the education is shifting it around. Like, it is not okay. I mean, it is not okay to expect a lot of free labor with volunteers that you use as indentured servants, for example. And I've often noticed on this, watch a priest, especially if he's a somewhat attractive male priest, and how he flirts with all the female volunteers to get them to do a ton of volunteer labor. And you do all this work to help the church, but really you're just building up your own ego, because what are you getting out of this?
Right.
And I'm looking as, well, the pastor acknowledges me. Well, my husband doesn't acknowledge me, or I'm single, I live at home. I go to church, I get affirmation. You get rewarded for being a volunteer indentured servant, so to speak. And the church is always, and volunteer organizations have always relied on volunteer labor. The question is it a mutually beneficial situation, or is it more servitude where you need to pay to play? And I'm looking back at some events, and you were nice and supportive and spiritual to me, but like with the Joel Osteen seminar, I call it a concert. You have to pay to play. Can you access this community without forking over money? And a lot of these groups, you can't. You have to pay for the conference. You have to pay for the books. You have to pay for the author speaker event. Can you just participate in the community organically?
Right.
There may be an admission fee, like there may be a pledging fee. There may be some membership requirements. I'm not saying, like with Meetup or whatever, there may be some small requirements to kind of join in and pay for expenses. But I'm just thinking, looking back on, are you being taken advantage of? And the answer is probably yes.
Yeah. Good. All this has been good, and we've spent a lot of time talking already. It's been good. I think we could go for another hour or two, and there's still plenty to talk about. But I want to thank you guys for being on the Desert Sanctuary today and getting to meet you kind of face to face here today. But can each of you just tell real briefly how do people get a hold of you, or how can they contact you if they want to talk more? Where are you, Brad?
Okay. Well, I mentioned that I have a background in being a futurist, and so somewhere in the early 2000 decade, I used the handle Futurist Guy because there were several Brad Sargents where I was from, and so we were getting mixed up a lot. But my blog is Futurist Guy, and that's at WordPress. So if you just do a search for Futurist Guy, you should find it. And from there, you'll see a listing of other blogs that I have. One is Field Guides, where I have tried to put a lot of this type of information in a very organized, systematic, step-by-step learning situation with visuals. And that's on Futurist Guy's Field Guides. So those are the two main blogs that I would recommend that have a lot of the material that I've written. And also to get in touch with me, the contact from there, the contact page.
Okay. All right. Becky?
Yeah, I have a website, beckygarrison.com, and on there is a contact page. Also, I have been writing about on spiritual narcissism, various aspects for spirituality and health. So if you Google spirituality and health, Becky Garrison, those articles will come up. And on my Facebook author page, I post all of my articles. I'm having a forthcoming article coming out on spiritual narcissism in an academic journal that'll be posted there, so people can go there. And I just think just continue, having the conversation. Whenever this is posted, this particular podcast episode, hop in the comments, ask us questions. There's a lot of resources that are starting to be developed. I'm hoping that we'll start to see more and more resource guides developed. I did a piece for the Wittenberg Door called Gaslighting for God. If you Google Gaslighting for God Part 1 and then Part 2, it's an 8-part series. That was a humorous way of putting all this information out there for people to kind of, beginnings of a resource guide to start. There's a number of authors there that I recommended. Michael Camp, Kathy Escobar are two people that have written on this. Laura Barringer and her father, Scott McKnight, have done The Church Called Tove. And you're starting to see a lot of stuff developing. And also be very careful that some people who are marketing themselves as religious trauma experts and narcissistic elements are in fact repeating the same pattern of the pastors by being narcissists themselves. So use your discernment when you're reading this and kind of read a lot of different material, and you'll find certain themes are evolving. That's the real good stuff, not just what one guru says, but what the research says overall.
Yeah. Man, this has been such a sober conversation. I really appreciate this. And hopefully we're going to get to do some more stuff down the road, or just have some more conversations as we go. For all of you out there listening, we want to thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you at the Desert Sanctuary, and remind you that Laura and I have listening sessions that are free whenever you want to contact us and just spend an hour or 45 minutes getting some stuff off your chest. We want to be able to do that, and we want to be able to keep doing it for free. So just get in touch with us through the normal channels. But thanks for tuning in today. And as always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
You are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.